So, hello, I'm Ricardo Simian, and as Yula said, I'm the founder of 3D Music Instruments, a startup for the experimentation and research on possible applications of 3D modeling and 3D printing technologies on music. The idea would be to develop new instruments and to make some research on many possible applications and things that we could do with this new set of technologies. So, 3D print is sort of a hot topic. It has been a hot topic for a while. Lots of people showing what they do with 3D print, but it has mostly been used for gadgets and silly things like this 3D printed bow tie.
Oops.
But this is not that silly at all in the end, because if you think that you couldn't have produced this geometry with other production methods, then you start thinking of the new things that you can produce with 3D printing technologies. And since I work in this area, I have received in the last weeks many requests and questions regarding possible uses of 3D printing in order to solve the shortage of equipment for the coronavirus crisis. And usually at the beginning of each talk, when I speak about this project, I have to explain a little bit about what 3D printing is, so that we know what we're talking about. So today I'm going to do both things at the same time. I think that's going to be very useful. So let's start. Let me see if I can get my screen. I hope that you're seeing my screen now. So we'll get to that later. It's not 1715 anymore. 3D printing. So what is 3D printing? Let's see this through 3D printed supplies against coronavirus. So a startup made a lot of noise the last weeks by introducing this 3D printed mask in order to solve the shortage of masks. And first of all, since this is going to be a rigid plastic mask, it's not going to fit your face in a tight manner. Therefore, it's not going to work. This is not going to help. This is not such a good idea as it seems, because the idea seems to be very good. You download the file, you 3D print this at home if you have a 3D printer, and we all solve this problem together. But this design is not really going to work. And you don't need to be an expert in masks also in order to realize that this mask is missing the filter. And the filter is the key component of a protection mask. And you can't 3D print that because that's a sort of tissue. But they do provide a solution. They say you cut a piece out of a mask and you put it in. But then you're not going to solve the shortage of masks by using masks in order to produce masks. But further than this almost joke, the material that you're going to use is also going to be very important. There are many 3D printers. 3D printing is not just one technology, it's a set of technologies for the different materials. You can 3D print in plastic, in metal, in wax, in glass, even in wood and porcelain and so on. And the different materials have different properties. And most of the materials that you can 3D print at home are going to be plastic, which through the 3D printing process are going to leave many spaces in between the layers, which are going to be ideal for bacteria to grow. So this is not the best thing that you can do in order to produce a mask. And there have been other examples, such as these 3D printed balls that were produced by a startup in Italy. So these are missing balls for breathers. And this seems like a much better idea. And of course, if you do have the technology and you can solve a problem like 3D printing a missing part, which is going to be vital, please do it. But make sure that you know what you're doing, because since I have been producing musical instruments that you're going to be breathing through, blowing through, putting in your mouth, I have been doing the analysis of which materials are biocompatible, which ones can you put in your mouth without negative reactions. And unfortunately, like for every material, most materials are not suitable for medical use. So wood is a natural and nice material, and you can sit on it, you can make chairs out of them, but by putting a piece of wood inside your mouth, most of the times you're not going to have a positive reaction. And there are many reasons why medical equipment are so expensive. And one of them is that they have to be produced with materials which are safe for medical use. And most materials are not. And from the palette of 3D printed materials, many of them, most of them, and almost every material actually that you can 3D print at home is not suitable for medical use. It may even be toxic. So if you know what you're doing, if you know the material that you have at hand, and you can solve a problem, please go for it. If you don't, you better don't, because you may be putting lives at risk, actually. And there are other examples, such as these face shields. This is a much better idea. Of course, you don't go into health safety issues by putting this on your forehead. But here comes another important aspect of this story, the scale of production. So 3D printers are amazing machines because they can produce very complex geometries, and you can even do it sometimes at home. But they are not particularly quick. So even 3D printing a small object like this one with a home 3D printer may take half an hour or a couple of hours. So if you work the whole day, you're going to produce a few of these, while a mass production facility could produce thousands, if not tens of thousands in the same time, with much less energy per unit, with a much lower price cost per unit. And therefore, if you want to help solving this crisis, by donating the amount of money that you would invest at home in electricity in order to do this, by donating it to a company mass producing them, you're going to be helping way more. So of course, if you are stuck at home and you want to feel useful and you have a 3D printer, go for it. But there are way more efficient manners, there are way more ecological manners to do so. And this brings us to the topic today, understanding 3D printing in terms of what can we do with them and what can't we do. And this has to do as well with the scale of production. So when we produce an object, we usually decide whether if we're going to produce a few copies of it or many copies. And according to that, we have to decide which production method are we to use. So if you are going to produce just a few copies of an object, you use traditional tools. You cut, you glue, and in your workshop, and you make a few copies. And if you need many copies, we usually use a factory, which is going to be using mass production methods like plastic molding and injection and so on. And this is kind of a difficult decision because you either produce many or you produce a few. And in order to mass produce an object, you need to produce thousands of copies because the initialization costs for setting up the machinery in order to mass produce is very high. Therefore, it's going to be affordable only when you're going to sell thousands and thousands of copies. And otherwise, in a small workshop, you can only produce a very few with a high cost per unit. So how do we produce middle range amounts? The answer is that actually we usually don't. When you decide to develop an object, you decide I'm going to do a very small niche 50 copies thing, or I am going to sell, I will have to sell 10,000 copies so that it becomes affordable. And that's where 3D print comes in as a game changer, because we can 3D print these middle range amounts. We can 3D print a couple of hundreds in a very efficient way. And that's exactly the scale of production that we need for music, because we usually don't need 10,000, but we need more than 10. So 3D print can really help us here. And on top, we can have high complexity that we couldn't have with traditional production methods, both traditional and mass production. We can have personalized versions. We can have new geometries that you couldn't think of otherwise, and much more. And when I say complex geometries, let me try to show you something. So, for instance, this is a traditional instrument, a cornetto. This is the traditional way it's shaped. And if you rethink this object in this way, by making a rolled version of it, you can come up to this geometry. And this geometry, you could never think of with any traditional method or without 3D modeling, because it's just impossible to produce, it's impossible to measure, to imagine, or to carve out by hand. It would be very, very difficult. So 3D print is for new things. For the things that we have been doing for hundreds of years, we already have very efficient production methods, which we have developed for those needs. But instead with 3D print, we should try to do new things rather than doing the same thing in a different way. And this is very difficult to explain because people usually expect me to deliver the same that they know, just cheaper or quicker. And it's not always going to be quicker nor cheaper, but rather the interesting part of it would be to make new things. So it's not 1750 anymore. Let's do new things, people. In order to understand this concept, we need to settle as well the concept of evolution, because this is a difficult concept because of the implications it has. So evolution is only the description of how things can change, gain complexity, or gain variation through an incremental step-by-step process. But it doesn't imply at all that the most evolved version is better. Actually, under certain points of view, the primitive version or the less evolved version can be or is better. So, for instance, bacteria are way better to survive than complex animals like us. Actually, in a couple of billion years from now, when the sun will burn way hotter than now, all animal and plant life is going to go away from Earth, but bacteria are going to be around still. So from that point of view, bacteria are better than we are. But if you're into culture, music, having conversations, I guess you're going to be more interested in Homo sapiens than in bacteria. And this evolution process, it doesn't only apply to biology, it also applies to design and production of objects in general. So like the evolution of the design of the car, moving from the first car, that's a 4T, the first mass-produced car, to a modern car, you still recognize it as a car. It has 4 wheels, it has a steering wheel, it has seats, it has windows. And most importantly, if you were able to drive an old car, you can drive a new car. But perfectly, you're allowed to say, I like better the old version. I'm a romantic person, I love the old version better. That's perfectly allowed. It's not implied in the evolution process that the new version is better necessarily. If you're interested in more autonomy, travel distance, fuel consumption, also how comfortable is it to drive it? You know, driving an old car is a very demanding task, actually, if you ever did it. Of course, under those parameters, the modern version is more efficient, and that's why we tend to use that version. And this evolution in design can be seen on every object, like typewriters turning into keyboards. And this has also been allowed by technical improvements. So we can produce things in a different way now. Therefore, these new technical possibilities have been included in order to allow for evolution of design. So an old typewriter is very heavy. They are amazing machines, but there are many reasons why we now have keyboards. And also the evolution implies opening for new possibilities. So now you can decide to have your squarish keyboard, an ergonomic one with support for your wrist, a curvy one, and so on. And that is connected both with this incremental design step-by-step evolution and by the technical possibilities which have allowed to produce these new versions. But if we have a look at music, we see this. And this is kind of weird, because on the left you have the latest version of a violin in 1650, and on the right you have the current one. And this requires an explanation. So why evolution is not happening on the basic design of musical instruments the way it is happening everywhere else? And actually, if you're not an expert, if you're not a trained musician, you wouldn't even notice that there are some changes, that the chin rest was added to the violin, that these little screws were added for microtuning, that the bridge angle changed, and the length of it changed as well. But the body of the instrument is still the same. Actually, Baroque violins are still being played around because the design hasn't evolved. And there are some exceptions. Some instruments have evolved a little bit, but mostly we are stuck in design from centuries ago, which were connected to the technical possibilities of those days. And this leads us to the question, why do we make things the way we make them? Which is a very interesting question if you're into design and thinking about why and how things are being produced. And in today's topic, why are musical instruments the way they are? Why do we use these designs? And this is not such an obvious question as it may seem. The answer is not necessarily because that's the best design, that's the best sound, that's the most ergonomic thing, but rather because of other reasons. For instance, very basic elements of the design of the instruments. Like, have you ever noticed that there's always a 90-degree angle between the walls of a violin or a string instrument and the cover of it, to form the body? Is it that because that 90-degree angle is the best possible angle, the best resonating angle? No, the real reason is because that was the best technical solution that they had in the 17th century to build the thing. They couldn't build it with curves. They had to build it with pieces of wood glued together. And then you come up with this technical solution, which is very efficient, but it was the best one that they had centuries ago. Or have you ever thought why woodwind instruments are always based in straight lines? It's not because that's the most ergonomic, most practical way, but rather because you have to drill a hole through a piece of wood, and you can only drill in straight lines. And that explains also why they're always round inside, because you can't drill in any other shape. And keyboards, like from this medieval keyboard till the modern keyboards, keys and the machinery behind them, it's always based on straight lines and 90-degree angles. And that's not because that's the best possible shape, but rather because you need to produce lots of keys and you can only cut in an easy way, in an efficient way, with primitive tools in straight lines. But nowadays we can produce any shape we want. We can 3D print any complex shape that we want. Therefore, we could move forward and think of other shapes. So wouldn't it be more efficient, nicer, ergonomic? Wouldn't it sound better to have curves instead of 90-degree angles around here? Actually, in nature, the best resonating shapes are based on curves. They are not based on 90-degree angles. And when are we going to move away from these straight lines now that we can produce any inner shape? And also not only in terms of the direction, but also in terms of the internal shape. Maybe oval inner bores are more efficient, or maybe any shape. Now we can produce any shape, and we should test this. And I'm not saying it's necessarily going to sound better if you shape it like a star, but we can at least, and we should at least, test other shapes. And as well for keyboards, you don't move into straight lines. Bodies don't move into straight lines. We move into curves. And you need to train yourself to move in a straight line, but your body would like to move in curves. And now we can produce all sort of shapes. And also, like basic elements, maybe you never wonder why, you never question this fact that all keys in keyboards are always horizontal. Is it because that's the best angle? I say that's just the only way they could produce them back then, and we are stuck, blocked in that way of thinking of them. But for your hands, I'm quite sure that other angle is going to be better. And I would be very surprised that if we tried every possible angle, then the best angle turned out to be horizontal. And we should try every shape and every angle and see what works better. And it seems like when we come to use 3D printing and new production methods into music, there are two extremes. We either do exactly the same again, like this 3D printed violin, which is an exact replica of an Amati violin. We're trying to make exactly the same, even though it's a completely different technology. Or we jump into the crazy extreme of throwing every concept out of the window and doing something entirely different. So this is a 3D printed violin, which I don't think we need to analyze it very deeply in order to realize why this design hasn't been adopted worldwide by orchestras yet. So it seems like you either do the same or you do something completely different instead of just using the normal way of doing things, which is evolution. When in evolution, we work with incremental steps. The user of one iteration should be able to use the next generation, and we learn from each iteration rather than throwing everything out of the window. So with this, I would like to make many tests, test new shapes, test new things, do many experiments to see which acoustics are better now that we can be free out of the limitations of the production methods, which only allowed for straight lines and square shapes or round inner bores, so that we can develop new instruments or new versions of existing instruments. We can have better ergonomics. We can solve problems. This is going to improve the health of our musicians. I don't think anyone knows any musician who didn't have health issues because of playing an instrument for many hours. And we can produce personalized instruments. So I have been doing some experiments. And when I started producing instruments, I tried to move away then from the limitations of the curves that of the straight lines and angles, so in order to allow for new shapes that you can easily 3D print, which would have been difficult to produce with other methods. This is funny because the camera doesn't recognize the instrument, but the idea is to produce instruments that you can play that still work, but that they move away from the limitations of the traditional methods, that they integrate curves in a more ergonomic way without throwing every concept out of the window, but rather step by step doing experiments. And then we go back to this. Usually, when you make a presentation, you're expected to be positive, motivational, and to motivate people in a very positive manner. But actually, I am quite at the point of saying, how dare we not using technology? How dare we not revisiting basic concepts of what we do in music through the new technology and still be stuck with the designs that were settled, were defined centuries ago? It's not 1750 anymore. We have new technology. We should be doing new things and moving forward. In order to wrap up, the usual answer I get is we like the instruments the way they are. And of course, you fall in love with an instrument if you practice for decades on it. But actually, I think that we're just used to them the way they are. And that's why we have such a difficult time trying to move away from the designs that we have around. And for instance, we're used to wood being the way it is. And wood is the way it is because of biology, biological processes, photosynthesis, and plants process materials and produce wood. But it's random fact that actually wood is the way it is. Actually, in the early Earth, the process through which plants produce energy was not through chlorophyll, the green stuff in leaves, but rather through a purple component. So the early Earth was actually purple. So that's a very funny thing. So if evolution had moved on with this principle, we wouldn't have green forests, but rather purple forests, and wood wouldn't be brown. Maybe it wouldn't be purple neither, but it certainly wouldn't be brown. It would be different. Let's say now it's brown. You can choose your own color. And then we would have nowadays purple wood and purple houses and purple chairs and purple orchestras and purple violins and purple flutes. And we would love them that way. And then if within that purple world, someone came with a brown violin and said, this is the new violin, what would you say? Would you say that's beautiful? Or would you say that's a very ugly color? I think that you would tend to say that's actually not such a nice color. And now that we can choose every color, now that you can choose every shape, we should move forward. And since I started talking about these possibilities, there have been several generations of cell phones and tablets and stuff, and things move forward, and in music, they don't. So I'm looking forward to meet partners who want to do this research. I can't do this all on my own. You can see on the website, 3dmusicinstruments.com, some of the researches that I have been doing. But I have been telling this all over the place, and things are not moving forward as quickly as they could, and they should actually. So if you are interested in supporting or partnering for research in order to develop further instruments through the new technologies that we have, I'm very looking forward to that. So that would be everything on my side. I don't know if there are going to be questions.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, very innovative thoughts. I think there was one question I saw here from Sabine. Please ask your question if you like.
Yes, hi. Hi. I thought you maybe can actually see me, but no, you can't. My name is Sabine, and very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Let me give you 2 sentences on my background. I'm a piano building company. The company is called Ibach, and actually from 1794, so very close to the date that you're talking about, 1750s. And I really want to encourage you to continue. Hold on, there we go. Or maybe you have a video now. Is it working now? Ah, great, very nice. Continue would like to encourage you to continue doing what you're doing. When I started working in our factory in 2004, one of the things I found so incredible was that there was absolutely no innovation in piano building that found its way into the mass market. There are things, yes, but it's always thinking in the same old piano instrument rather than sort of trying to go new ways. And so I don't really have a question, but I have encouragement and I have, well, the offer that we should talk and maybe get some ideas together on the ground and try and change also the attitude of musicians, because my experience from when we were doing these rather innovative things at the beginning of the 2000 years was that the artists themselves found it extremely difficult to come to terms with new technology. That might be changing, hopefully, but really we need the user to want new things rather than only us wanting to do new things. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Please let's talk about this. I think that has to do with several factors. From one side, I think we have been introducing new technology only sideways, like putting electricity into keyboards or putting electricity into certain instruments, but not really changing the instruments themselves. But there are many reasons, of course. You should innovate in a way which the user can take in. If you need to retrain entirely in order to play the new keyboard, you're not going to be very successful. The same way that the new version of the car has to be drivable by the user of the last version. So it should be incremental, slow, acknowledging not only the technology, but the user base and the usability. And of course, it's difficult. Once something is so spread around and so settled, it's difficult to innovate. But we have way better tools than we had just 5 years ago in order to do this. So I think that it's the time really to move forward now that we can.